So, when it comes to Jordan Neely, there are a few things that I'd like to talk about. And I think a lot of about it comes down to the building of narratives. So, right away, we saw quite a few narratives being built. One, was around race. And I think we can pretty safely say that race was not a factor in his treatment, considering that the three men who were involved in an incident were of various races. Um, and the other aspect of it is, mental health and homelessness and how we treat people uh, in that situation and the system. And then the third part, and I think this is where I'd like to start, is how quickly we jump to conclusions and how certain we are of our views or conclusions in the face of very little evidence. So, of course, like many others, I watched the video or videos. There's multiple videos now that have come out. I've read the articles, but ultimately, we very often rush, in this case, in many other cases, we rush to this whole trial by social media. And this is a very dangerous thing. So, while, yes, we see what happened on the camera, on the video, there is so much information that is missing. And yet, we become the jury, the esteemed jury of social media, and we decide with such certainty, and I can't believe the certainty that some people have in this situation, what has really transpired. And by the way, we have some facts that the people involved don't have. For example, the fact that there were 44 prior arrests. Those are not facts that people on the train would have had about Jordan Neely, for example. We know that some of these arrests were violent, some were not. Um, there are some things that we do not really see on the video. For example, what is the level of threat that Jordan had that day shown? And the only thing that we can really consider in that situation is what happened, what transpired on that day. Were the actions justified on that particular day? Right? So, Um, and there's a lot of information missing. And yet we rush to these conclusions. For example, was he threatening? What was the nature of that threat? Were the people involved in genuine fear for their lives or the lives of their fellow passengers? And is that what caused them to react in the way they did? We do know that the force that was applied led to a death. I think most people will agree that that was not the intended outcome, but force was applied. And I think something that also comes up is that, to me, looking at this case, it's very much indicates a failure of the system. And that system had really failed several people on that day and generally. So we have a massive failure of the mental health system. So Jordan Neely, as much as he's, some people like to paint him as this innocent uh, person, but he was certainly somebody who was threatening to those around him. But he's also dealing with severe mental illness issues and was repeatedly arrested and then thrown back, um, to deal with his circumstances. He's obviously not equipped to deal with what's happening in his mind. And he is violent and is a danger to others, perhaps also to himself, but at the same time he's not equipped to deal with it. And as a society, we failed him, or the system failed him because it did not give him the tools, or the housing or the care to prevent him from returning over and over again, to the subway, or being on his own, left to fend for himself. So in that way, the system failed Jordan Neely. On the other hand, you have the passengers, who I think are rightfully afraid for their lives, or at least feel threatened when somebody like Jordan Neely, is acting erratically. Errat- I can't say the word, but you know what I mean. And I had many experiences actually interacting with such people. I certainly do feel uncomfortable. Luckily, these altercations haven't led to anything. Um, but they can, and you don't know how somebody is going to react. Even somebody who's, say, high on drugs. I know somebody who was stabbed with a needle. Yes, that person is high out of their mind. They're not in control of themselves. And they don't necessarily want to hurt somebody else, but they're just not in control of themselves. And that's what happened, right? So they can be a danger. And it's fair to worry, because that behavior is not predictable. Now, you want to do whatever you can to get yourself out of that situation, and minimize any potential of violence, of escalating the situation. And again, I think the most honest answer in terms of judging that situation is, like, I don't know, right? Because I don't know what exactly led to this. That was the only, um, if that, in that particular situation, if that's the only way they saw out of it, um, ideally, a reasonable person would, try to remove themselves from the situation, call for assistance, which I know they did, but assistance did not come for about 15 minutes, by which point it was too late. That was a very long response time. And so the system in that way failed the passengers, because they felt like they needed to take matters into their own hands. And now we're seeing sort of vigilante justice. Was that justified? Well, again, it's going to depend on what the exact circumstances were. If they were threatened to the point where their lives were at stake, or at least their physical well being was justifiably at stake, maybe. And, the restraint kind of went terribly wrong. Now, perhaps that is not the case. Perhaps there were other ways to have prevented, to have restrained the person. I mean, there were three men there. So I think with three people involved, there were perhaps other ways to restrain this person. Um, or perhaps restraining wasn't even justified at all, based on what happened in the moments before, whether it was a physical threat. So again, I can't comment on whether it was justified of a move or not, because I can't, I don't have all the facts. But from these men's point of view, they felt like the system was not there for them to ensure their safety. And it does seem like certain crimes have gone up, and so on and so forth. And people do feel like this kind of thing happens very often on the subway, not just in New York, but in other cities. I mean, I certainly, in where I live, experience that sort of thing a lot. There's people spitting, there's people hitting. I take measures to remove myself from these incidents, but stuff does happen. Things definitely happen to other people. I've just been pretty fortunate, but I certainly know that many people are afraid, avoid certain bus routes, for example, avoid certain locations, and some of them have no choice but to go through them to get home. So it's not a, you have to look at sort of both sides and sort of figure out. So And this is where it kind of comes down to the mental health crisis, which I think is happening in many places. And it's something that, it's so interesting to me because when I talk to about it to people on all spectrums, right? Left, right, everybody seems to agree on this point, right? Everybody agrees that we have a problem. Everybody agrees that we should be trying to solve it. They even agree about spending money on this. And yet it seems like it's not in the politicians' interest to make that as part of their platform, to make that as part of their spending, because it doesn't seem to help their political aims, I suppose. And so nothing ever happens. But we have a situation where to get any kind of help is incredibly difficult. So where I am, so in Canada, for example, we have socialized medicine, but psychologists are not free. They're very expensive. I mean, they run from anywhere from, I don't know, $200 to 280 an hour. And good luck finding a good one. Many of them have wait lists of up to a year, if you can even afford one, right? Which is very expensive. Most people can't. Psychiatrists, which are covered, are incredibly difficult to get. Again, you're going to be waiting for at least a year if you have a big need. And on top of it, they're pretty much only doing, they're prescribing medications. Most of them are not going to do talk therapy. And the truth is, most people need a combination probably of the two. But you're only getting one of. And so it's really, really difficult. It's really complicated. Um, and there's like such scarcity of these resources. And then you have some counseling and some other kinds of resources, but even that's really lacking. In the US, from what I understand, you have similar problems. So even people with insurance who have coverage for these therapists, which by the way, in Canada, you also can have coverage, um, but in the US, I was told by some people where some many practitioners do not take their insurance for various reasons. Um, Again, it's very difficult to find somebody. There is a great shortage, and it's also very expensive. So a lot of the people who are really struggling the most are often the people who are going to be less able to afford it. There is also just a general increase in mental health issues. And, you know, as for the causes, I don't know. I mean, I think there's many aspects to it. I think there is issues around community. I think people are feeling incredibly lonely. I think there's elements of, social media, but also for sometimes for people, that's the only way that they have any support networks is social media. Um, I think economic circumstances play a role. I think as a society, they're often failed. If people have substance abuse, I've talked to some people about, you know, how dealing with substance abuse, and it seems incredibly difficult when somebody is has those issues to treat them. So it's like it's really much more about how do you get them early on, that they don't have these circumstances, broken homes and abuse and things like that. And it's a very, very complex issue to solve. Um, and a lot of people are forgotten. And then, of course, you have people with much more kind of severe things that require more, psychiatric care, medication, and probably guided care. They probably can't handle things on their own, and people are very quick to let's reopen the asylums and and in this kind of careless way. And I do think they need care facilities, some people, and their families can't always take care of them because they're working jobs, and the care that they require is often a lot more demanding that they're able to provide. But this idea that, you just force people into a home, and it creates a lot of issues, right? First of all, is like, how do we decide? There are all these problems that happened in the past where people were signed in and couldn't sign out against their will, and they weren't necessarily, beyond. They should have been able to be let out. So that's obviously an issue. But in some cases, they really can't ever be on their own. Um, but there's interesting models that I've seen where they live in these facilities, and they get to do activities and go on field trips, and they get good care. So I think it's doable with good oversight, and having these spaces not look like the traditional mental institutions of horror movies, but rather have lush green atmosphere, greenery and flowers everywhere, and meditation or things like that, and movie nights. I think there's ways to create environments that are great, good, safe environments for these people. We need to take better care of our vulnerable populations, and the same goes to, I think, prisons. And this kind of, I think this is why we kind of ignore some of these populations. It's kind of what happens with prisons, but even more so, because people kind of tend to hate people who've committed crime, which I get. But they have family members. They're at some point might be members of our community again. um we feel detached from them in a way. And that detachment, I think, is what keeps us from being as invested and trying to help them. You know, we almost put blinders on, where we don't want to look at them, we don't want to see them, and we'd rather be pushed away somewhere and kept somewhere. But the truth is, they're still part of our community. So, I think this is why a lot of times they're ignored. And this is my socialist part coming out. But I think part of being a community member is that you take care of your least, of your most vulnerable members when they need that help, when they genuinely need that help. And and unfortunately, they're not probably going to vote. They're not that population that you're trying to reach. But they have family members that love them, and they have cousins, and they shouldn't be forgotten. And I think, the narrative around Jordan Neely, I obviously, it's very overhyped in many ways, but perhaps the hype around it will help bring some sort of awareness for these other issues, which I think, mental health, and also public safety, which is also very important, because public does deserve to feel safe. And maybe finding some sort of middle ground for the two, is key, because um, both both deserve that. And and while these kind of politics around it get sort of settled, I hope it brings something good, as opposed to just playing the blame game and providing commentary because you're the first to get the clicks, and saying you're right, or you're right, or anyways. I'm way past my talking point, so I've over talked. um, but let me know your thoughts, and leave me some comments below. And I apologize for any incoherent thoughts that you may have heard here. And please subscribe, comment, like, dislike if you must, and I'll talk to you soon.